Alright, today's topic is going to be temperature gauges. The Jeep Cherokees and a lot of the older Jeeps had basically all the gauges you could ever want. So this is pretty decked out for, stock automotive stuff. But for us auto transmission guys, there's something we should really be taking a look at, and that is a transmission temperature gauge. So this is going to be kind of a two-part thing. The first part is going to be transmission temperature gauge. So we're going with a good old Autometer. They're expensive, but they're worth it. You know, it's good, very high quality stuff. So I went with number 8349, and this is a GM factory style looking gauge. So this is the closest one I could find for my gauges. So I just feel like the font kind of matches quite well. Obviously it doesn't have a yellow needle, but you know, for what I'm trying to look for, I think that'll look good. Now the second part is going to be, well, how the hell do you mount it? I've seen a couple different things that people do. I've seen it very popularly mounted over here in the trans shifter area. You just cut out a little circle here and mount it there. And that's kind of cool. You can do that if you like. I've seen some guys mount it over here on this side of the console. Or you could do some pods. On other vehicles I've seen them up here, which is interesting. But I am going to use a lot of this unused space over here with a dual gauge pod. And this is another Autometer one. This one is meant specifically for XJs. So this is a 15210. And this little pod should do everything we need. So it's just plastic mold. It's flat on the back. And it fits up snugly against the A-pillar, and you just mount it where you like. And there you go, you got two gauges. Alright, since this is more of a factory kit and not a an all-purpose kit, it doesn't come with any T-fittings or any wiring or any crap like that. So you will have to make some of the stuff that you are going to use. You get some thumb screws for this gauge mount. This is the gauge mount that it comes with. Is a an in-dash flush mount install. So you would cut a hole, slide the gauge through, and then you use this as a backing plate. So with that attached, you put on those thumb screws and tighten it, and it'll squeeze itself against whatever material you're mounting it through. So then you'd have a flush mount. Along with that, you get your temperature sender, which is a 1/8 inch NPT, standard size. And this is self-grounded, so all you need to do is run the positive wire from this or whatever. And it comes with two NPT adapters. If I recall, one is a 3/8 inch and one is a 1/2 inch. For my installation, I'm going to try something that I saw mentioned online that would be awesome, because we're going to talk about where to put the senders in a second. But I got this metric adapter, number 2267. It is an M14 by 1.5. So this adapter should do what we need. Okay, so outside the vehicle again, we'll take a look at our transmission and whatnot. So when we come out of under the vehicle, our cross member is here, and here is our transmission. So this is an AW4 automatic transmission. You'll find these commonly behind 4.0s, very common in Jeeps. And there's a variant of them in Toyotas, and we'll get to that in a second. But from our transmission, we have the front, I believe, is the hot line that goes out to the cooler, and the one on the back is the cold line that goes back into the transmission. So, right here is basically everywhere that people like to monitor. Some people like to measure the hot side, so they can see the maximum temperature of the fluid and know that, you know, things are getting hot and they need to step it back a little bit. Other people like to see how efficient their coolers are, so they'll measure the cold side. So, you know, as long as the transmission is getting cold fluid, you know it's okay. If that temperature starts to rise, you know you got issues where your cooler's not working or you're starting to exceed the limitations of your cooler. The third option is to measure inside the pan, so you know the average temperature, like the running temperature of the transmission. And that one is what I feel is the most important. Because sure, you can see the hot side and the cold side, but, you know, when you look at the engine temperature, you don't look at the output of the radiator or the input from the water pump. You're looking at what the average engine temperature is, at least on my model. The temperature sender's on the back of the head. So this gives you an average temperature of the fluid. The temperature of the fluid is very important. Heat is the enemy. The hotter you get your transmission fluid, the quicker it's going to wear out. And this rises exponentially. There's actually really nice charts online that talk about transmission fluid and how many miles it'll last. But the hotter you get it, the quicker it'll wear out. It'll start burning up seals, you'll start getting varnishes, you'll start wearing out clutches. And I think it goes all the way up to about 325. If your average running temperature is 325 degrees Fahrenheit, your fluid's only going to last you about 500 miles before your transmission craps out. So this is very important for longevity of your transmission. Now, back to that Toyota thing. I said I wanted to measure the inside of the pan. Well, in order to do that, you'd have to either find a bolt that'll fit this. I forget what size this is. I think this is a 10 millimeter by 1.5. And you could get an adapter that fits in there. You could get something like that. A lot of people say that you'll hit them on the rocks, but this sits pretty low. So as long as it's only sticking out a little bit, you'll be fine, and you could just run the wire sideways. But on Toyotas that run the AW4 variant, I forget what it's called because it's got a couple extra letters, but it's like an A304 or something like that. Up over here, right next to that hot output line, you'll notice a bolt. It is a T55 Torx, I believe. So that guy is what we're after. On Toyota transmissions, that one has a temperature sender in there so that you can see what the average running temperature of the transmission is. And I figure since it's near the hot side, it might get a little warmer, so you know you'll still get the upper end of your temperature range. And you won't have to drill, you won't have to tap, you won't have to break up any of your lines or anything like that with T-fittings. You'll be fine. And this is what, you know, the Toyota transmissions use. That's where they put the temperature sender. So you figure from the factory that's something kind of useful. 98 and newer XJs, you will not have that port because it is blanked out. You'll just see a flat spot. So if that's the case on you guys, you'll have to figure out something else. After some beating, you should be able to get the dipstick tube forward enough to be able to access that. It should already be in the front a little bit, but I don't know. I took this transmission out once or twice, so I'm sure that tube bent a little bit. But the way I did it, I just took this extension, I squeezed that T55 in there, I started at an angle, and then started prying it forward to bend it, and then if you take a hammer and start tapping on this a little bit, it'll help deform the metal enough to start to get it to inch. It's not super hard, so you should be able to get it to move. Just make sure that when you're bending, you watch this. Make sure you're not over bending it and you're going to crack your pan or your tube or something like that. It's just a dipstick tube, but you know, it still holds fluid, so you don't want it to leak. Here's the sensor inside the adapter. Now, since this is national pipe thread, it has a taper, so you won't be able to screw this sensor all the way into the body. You're going to tighten it until it's tight. So right now that's about tight. Just for clearance, let's make sure that this guy is going to fit in here. So it's going to look like that. Yeah, I think we'll have just enough because that sensor starts to get narrower. So if you don't have some eyelet connectors or stuff like that, it's a very good idea to get small packs of different sizes if you do a lot of wiring and custom work, because these eyelets come in handy for all kinds of crap, man. Battery lugs and just all kinds of wiring things. I've used this so many times. It's very helpful. So the bag that I found, it was marked number 10. So I don't know if that correlates to whatever size these things are. I'd assume so. Now the colors indicate what thickness wire gauge you're using. The red that I've seen is the smallest, the blue is medium, the yellow is large, and then the ones that don't have any colors are usually like extra large, and they'll be all kinds of different sizes. So I found these two that fit. So when we figure out what kind of wire we'll use, we can do that. Alright, a little bit of this Permatex high temperature thread sealant should do just fine. It's probably not even necessary. I'm pretty sure that's what the point of pipe thread is. Since it's tapered, when you tighten it down properly, it should, self-seal. But, whatever. A little precaution doesn't hurt too much. So this is what it looks like when it's fully tightened. I didn't put too much force on it. I was tightening this with a quarter inch socket, so you don't put too much force on it. And from thread to thread, we do have continuity. So our sensor's still going to work. If you don't have continuity, that means your thread sealant is completely closing off the connection, and you can't have that. Because like I said before, this is self-grounding. This kit that I bought comes with a copper crush wing. So we'll make sure that's on there. Okay, so when you take your plug out, it should look a little something like this. Have a rubber O-ring on there, and it's just a little, star plug. That's about it. So make sure that you pry that O-ring back so that it separates from the transmission. You don't want two sealing surfaces, because then you're definitely going to have a leak. Then you come up here, and you put your sender in. So, I didn't lose nearly as much fluid as I thought I was going to. Only a little bit came out, not very much, just a few drips here and there, so, minimal loss. It was a tight squeeze, but we got it to fit. Now, when it comes to tightening, sometimes bigger isn't always better. I know it's hard to believe, gentlemen, but sometimes your big old wrench just ain't gonna cut it. Especially because we have two lines in the way, and you can't go down. So I had to get a little 6-inch stubby and tighten it from the top. So now she's good and tight. So part one is basically complete. Cool. So now comes the gauge mounting. So this will fit on here like this. Now if you still have your stock screws, make sure that you leave openings so that you can get to the screw here. And there's another one back there. This one is a particular pain in the ass to get to, so I never actually reinstalled it. Besides that, the only other thing that I can think of is, for instance, you don't want to set it up so that it's touching against the dash. The only reason is if this panel starts to wiggle or your dash starts to wiggle, like on the highway when you start getting vibrations and stuff like that, if these are moving at different speeds, they might squeak or make noise, and that is going to bug the ever-living shit out of you. So make sure you leave a little bit of a gap so that, things can wiggle and not hit each other. So besides that, find a spot, mark it, and then we need to decide where we want to mount those Christmas trees. They recommend a 3/16 inch hole for these little things to fit properly. So get yourself a 3/16 inch drill bit and go to town. So drill yourself a hole in the gauge. You drill a hole in the pod, and then you go into the trim. Now I took out this screw just to make sure there was nothing important back here. The only thing that I found, I was originally going to put it in the side here, but it looks like the weather stripping is kind of there. The important part of the weather stripping is over here, so I don't really think it would matter that much, but it might go into metal or something, so whatever, we'll just keep it simple and go in through the front. The directions say that you have to make a hole so that you can run all your wires through, because obviously once your pod is on here, you got to figure out where your wires are going to go. If you want it to look nice, you're going to want the hole to be behind the thing. Because, you could run them back and down, but you'd see wires back there, and there's a decent amount that I have to go through here. So what I'm going to do is use a little hole saw like this guy, and I'm going to make a hole right about here. And, just put a hole in there, because that'll be low enough that the wire should easily be able to reach the gauge. It'll still be hiding behind everything, and you won't see it. And it'll give you nice access for running the stuff. Make sure there's nothing big back there that we're going to run into. Right now it looks pretty good, so let's see how it goes. We're going to try our broken bit and see if that don't help. Better, but still hitting something. Maybe a little ballsy, but let's see if this thing will track itself now. Sweet. Good thing I moved that wire out of the way. Okay, so now with this lined up, get a nice little access hole to run our wires. And it's far enough back that the rear gauge should be able to use that hole as well. Sweet! Alright, I think I might run wires before I drill the other holes. Okay, so here's my simple little diagram for where everything's going to go. So, on our gauge, we have a total of 5 connections. Now, this is backlit. It's an LED backlight, so it's real fancy looking. And I want it to come on when the dash lights come on. So when you turn your lights on, you can see it better here. So when you turn the headlights on, the lights come on. And when you turn it off, they go off. So, up at the top, we have our positive and our negative for the light. And if you look up here, you can see it, 12 volt positive and ground for the light. So those 2 terminals will run off where we need to. On my Jeep, you can dim the gauges. So coming from the headlight switch is a resistor. So it is positively dimmed. So the negative can go to any ground. Some fancy import cars, they're resistance grounded instead. So you'd want to make sure that the ground is hooked up properly as well. That's why they give you a separate terminal. But for Jeeps, it's simple. So we can connect our ground and our negative for our light together and just ground them at the same spot. So that's easy. For the positive, for the light, you can either run it to the switch. This guy right here, you'd have to like pull it out and do a bunch of bullshit to get to it, which is going to be a pain in the ass. Or what I'm going to do is down here, there's actually, these are lit. There's little tiny bulbs behind them. And obviously, I took one of the bulbs out for my winch switch. So I'm going to just tap off the positive wire from there and run that up to the gauge. So we got our positive figured out and our negative. Same with the ground for the gauge itself. That'll just get grounded. And then the other 2 wires, we have our sender and our ignition positive. So the sender, you run from the gauge all the way down to the transmission. And that'll just plug in, and that's self-grounded. So that's the only wire we got to run there. And then we just need a positive for the gauge, and that'll be an ignition wire coming from the key. Because if you just hook this up to positive, your gauge will run off all the time, and you don't want that. So if we come down here to our fuse box, you can see that there are a couple wires that I have hooked up right now. The only ignition wires that I found are the first one at the top left, that green one that says accessory. That one is currently being used by my my shift interlocked, so whatever, I'm just going to leave that for now. The next one is this red one over by the clock. That is being used by my CB. And then over there you see another one that says ignition, that blue one, and that one's being used by the lockers. The white one is hot at all times, and so are the rest of these. So you basically only got those 3 ignition. Now if you want to find these yourself, it's pretty easy. Just get yourself a voltmeter. Probe all these with the ignition off, and if you find ones that don't have any power, turn the ignition on and see if you get power. If you do, you get an ignition circuit and you're set. So now we just got to get all our wires and run them all up to this hole. So let me see what kind of scrap I got laying around. We don't need anything big here. We're not running a whole lot of amps through these things. I think this thing said 18 gauge wire is acceptable. Okay, so I found some old trailer wiring, and it's got tons of wire on it. And it's got enough wires for what we need. It's got 4 long ones. It actually had 5, but one of them's clipped, but that's okay because we're running 2 grounds together anyway. And they're in pairs, which is nice, so it'll keep them a little tidier. And they're all different colors, so it should be pretty easy to figure out. Okay, before I start cutting all this wire to length and all that, it's going to be better to run this. So, the hard part is going to be getting the wires to go from the access hole that we created down to, well, you know, everywhere else that we need it. So, what I did is I took some thick wire that's easily bendable but still holds its strength. I pushed it through the hole, and if you snake it just right, you can get it to take that little tiny bend, and then it starts going in behind the dash. So, if you look up to there, you can see the light, and that's where it's coming from. So then you just push it around until you get it where you want. So here's my tracer wire here, and I'm going to have it go over top of this beam so that it's held up and out of the way. So now that we got that hanging down here, we can use that to pull the rest of them up. you take a little electrical tape and connect them all together so that they will fish through a lot easier, don't get cut up on things. You'll just either hook this in here or electrical tape it or something, and then you just pull it up and you just go wire fishing. Look at that. Ta-da! Sweet. Now we're talking. Okay, so once we have all our wires run, we can start putting our ends on them and get them all ready. So the way that I like to do it is I'll put a little loop in it and push it through, so that way there's a little more wire over here. And you can just crimp it and call it a day if you'd like. I like to go the extra mile and solder a little blob on there, just to make sure that it's definitely a good connection and it's not going anywhere. And then once that's done, you're set. Okay, so this mess might look a little complicated, but again, the colors help quite a lot. So I'm going to have my solid green wire running to the sender. The green with brown stripe is going to be my ground. And if you notice, I jumped the light, so it just goes right into the ground. A little piggyback. Our yellow with brown stripe is going to be our ignition wire, and our yellow wire, our yellow solid wire, is going to be the positive feed for the light. So now that we got all that hooked up, everything should be set up and we can just run it as is. I'm going to put little bits of duct tape every foot or so, because it keeps the wires together and it makes a really nice installation. Okay, got a lot of the dash ripped apart. This thing's being a pain in the ass, but I just wanted to show you guys what this looks like. So back behind your switches, you'll see this this little section here is where these bulbs sit. And, they light up. You probably don't know about them because they've probably been burnt out forever, or they just got bad contacts in them or something. But you'll have two on each side if you have the proper wiring. I believe the orange is the positive that we want, and the black is just the ground. So I'm probably going to take one of these guys and use them. If not, you'd have to see what you could do with the headlight switch back here, if you could use that for anything, or find a different wire to tap into. So up here, I cut this orange black wire and put it into my brown yellow, and that's going to be the positive feed for the light. Our ground cable, our green brown, has an eyelet connector that I'm going to hook up to all the other grounds that are floating here on that screw. Next we have our yellow, which is going to be our positive for the gauge, and that goes to ignition. I've got a male blade connector. I cut off the protective sleeve, that way it'll slide right into where the fuses go. And then the last wire, the solid green, we'll have to run all around to our sender and hook it up with another eyelet. So I'm going to plug all these in, and we should be able to put the dash back together. Okay, everybody's all hooked up and happy. Same with the ground. Now for the sender, you're going to find yourself a hole in the firewall that you can run that wire. There's quite a few of them. There's one on the left, and then there's one that's harder to get back here, and I'll show you that one because that one's a little less full. So in the hood, you can use this one right over here, which is for the hood release cable. That one's kind of full though, so I'm using this one over here. So there's our green wire, and I just have that run over there, over top the engine, and it runs down there. Okay, so after you've run your wire down your transmission, this is the final step. Put an eyelet connector on there, connect it to your sender, put the nut on, make sure that it's not touching anything else, and you're good. Okay, when you're all done, it should look like that. You got your wire running up there, everything's all pretty. It's out of the way, not touching any hot stuff, so we're set. Okay, now that we got all our wires run, we got our 4 holes drilled. I decided to put one in the middle because I felt like it was pushing back too hard, so I didn't really care about trying to reach back there. So now we can set up for a final install. Make sure your wires run through. And then we're just going to push our Christmas trees into all the holes. And then we can just push the gauge in and we're done. This would be the time if you wanted to paint these things. These are, plastic, so if you have some kind of plastic paint, you can paint them to match the interior. I'm running a lot of black already, so with the gray and the black, it kind of blends in. So I'm going to keep it black. Okay, so here we are. We're at the final step. All our Christmas trees are pushed in, and it's being held in place rather well. Actually pretty well for little plastic clip thingies. Alright, so here's the last step. You ready? It's very tricky. It's going to take a lot of measurements and a lot of calculations. And we're done. Ta-da! That's all it is, just a press fit. There you go. Got ourselves a transmission gauge. It lights up too. And it dims because we hooked it up to the dimmer circuit. It's brighter than the stock gauges. You can't even see them, but sweet. Okay, so here we are sitting at about 20 miles on the highway. Temperature is pretty high. Trans was sitting at about 120, now it's slowly coming up to 140 since we've been sitting. Interesting, so when you sit, temperatures definitely rise quite a lot. So now we're gonna go back and see what happens. Okay, so we seem to have leveled off. We're about 15 miles after the last update. Temperature is pretty much kind of pegged. Transmission is leveled off a little bit above 140, and this has been like this for the past 10 miles, so I don't know. After only sitting for about 10 seconds, you can see it's jumped up to 160 now. So that's after sitting, after getting right off the highway. So we'll see what it looks like when we park. Okay, so this is after driving for another 5 miles at around 45. So I turned the heat on full blast, and it dropped the heat quite a bit, and then I turned it off and it came up a little bit. So here's the transmission gauge. It was sitting at about 160 when I was slowing down a little bit, but when I got back on up to speed, it would drop down to about 150. So now this is parked. This is the highest I've ever seen it. It's sitting at about 180. So after highway drives, it seems like while you're moving, the temperature seems to be pretty consistent. Once it gets up to temperature, it doesn't really seem to go any higher or any lower. Just to check accuracy, here we are underneath. Transmission pans reading about 180, 178, 186. Get in and compare that to our gauge. That's about what she's running at right there. That would be 190, maybe a little more. So this thing looks like it's pretty accurate for measuring the transmission temperature as if it were in the pan. So cool. I'm pretty happy with that. It's eye-opening. It wasn't quite what I was expecting. I figured the trans temperatures were going to get pretty high, but on the highway they didn't peak over 160. I mean, they were really pretty constant around like 145. Okay, so just driving around town, I noticed my temperature was getting up a little high. It was sitting about 160 driving around town. Just sitting here parked, it's risen up to 180. So it actually gets hotter just doing the slow stuff than on the highway when it's more constant around 140. So I've learned some stuff. So actually a transmission cooler would probably benefit you more if you're around town guys than highway use. So also that I'm going to put on a lower fan switch so that they come on earlier, but we're learning things. This is interesting.